were leaders of the New York underground scene, and they changed the sound of rock and roll in the 70s.
People thought that the Ramones were a cartoon who weren't to be taken seriously, but they should be taken seriously, and they were revolutionaries.
The Ramones were the greatest punk rock band of all time. I might even say that they're greatest rock and roll band of all time.
John Cummings, who would become Johnny Ramone, was born in Queens, New York on October 8, 1948. Thomas Erdely, who would become Tommy Ramone, was born in Budapest, Hungary on January 29, 1949. Jeffrey Hyman, who would become Joey Ramone, was born in Queens, New York on May 19, 1951. And Douglas Colvin, who would become Dee Dee Ramone, was born in Fort Lee, Virginia on September 18, 1951.
It all happened in Forest Hills, New York, where Johnny and Tommy had been playing in a garage band called Tangerine Puppets.
Joey Ramone, Jeff Starship as he was then known, was in a kind of glam rock band called Sniper.
Dee Dee had been living in West Germany, where his father was a soldier, and they'd moved into the Queens area, and he became part of their local tribe of misfits.
Douglas Colvin was a huge Beatles fan, and he was inspired by Paul McCartney's alter ego, Paul Ramon, which he used when he checked into hotels when he was part of the Silver Beatles. So he decided to change his name to Dee Dee Ramone, and he also persuaded the rest of the band members to do the same, and that they should be called the Ramones. When the Ramones first played at CBGB's in New York in 1974, I think it was a smack in the face for the live music scene. I mean, this is a time when the likes of ABBA and the Osmonds are in the charts.
Their sets would last sometimes for as little as 17 minutes, and in that time, they would play 12 or 13 songs. It was so fast, it was so speedy.
The other striking thing about the Ramones is their appearance. I mean, now, how many bands wear, you know, leather jackets and ripped t-shirts and very, very skinny jeans and dirty old Converse? All of them. But then it was unusual because most people were in big flares and capes and all the rest of it.
And here you had these kind of snotty, angry, leather-jacketed outsiders playing this music very, very soon. Their reputation began to grow, but the Ramones were always tight. They were always brilliantly rehearsed.
In 1975, the Ramones were discovered by Danny Fields, who was kind of a journalist, a bit of a music hustler, a promoter, and he got them a record deal with Sire Records. They released their debut in 1976, self-titled album Ramones. The opening track of the debut album Ramones is Blitzkrieg Bop, which is such a great introduction to the Ramones. It really sets out what they are. It's kind of tear your face off, loud. It's got all these controversial themes about the war and about violence. The violence in the backseat, the generation the faith in the backseat,
Blitzkrieg Bop. Nobody had had anything like it. You had these songs like Blitzkrieg Bop, Beat on the Brat, Now I Want to Sniff Some Glue.
It was recorded on a minuscule budget, just over $6,000. And as they would for the next few albums, they recorded their songs in the order that they played them live to keep that sense of spontaneity going.
The critics loved it. Robert Christgau from the Village Voice, who's a notoriously tough rock critic, saying, I love this record. I don't care if there's dodgy humour about Nazi Germany, you know, I think this is just absolutely fantastic.
It wasn't a huge success in the way that the Ramones would never really be a huge commercial success, but it was a starting point for punk rock.
The Ramones were thought of as the first punk band because they were the first punk band. You know, this was 74, 75 when they got going. Rock had become ponderous. Everything was about showing how great you were and how accomplished you were, and, you know, and trying to prove that this is a serious musical form that could stand up alongside classical and jazz and can fill stadiums. Ramones stripped all that away. It was back to the garage.
In 1976, the Ramones went to England to play at the Roundhouse in London, and they were supporting the Flaming Groovies, and this was a really important moment for the band and for punk rock.
Beat on the brat with the baseball bat. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh.
They met members of the Sex Pistols, they met members of the Clash, and in that night, then they really catalysed the UK punk rock movement.
The Ramones' second album, Leave Home, was released in January 1977.
Leave Home was a great album. It had Pinhead, which was inspired by the film Freaks, Shock Treatment, which is about getting, electric shock therapy, for kicks. But at the same time, it had California Sun, the old surf tune. So the Ramones had these two sides which were complementary. There's the very, very innocent, fun, kind of 60s surf element to it, where it's just, going to the beach and all the rest of it. And then there are these songs which are in deliberate bad taste about, getting zapped with, 10 million volts through your brain.
Later that year, Rocket to Russia was released.
Rocket to Russia was released in 1977, just 10 months after Leave Home. And you could see that they're developing so quickly.
Rocket to Russia has got some absolutely classic Ramones tracks on. Teenage Lobotomy, Sheena is a punk rocker. This is the Ramones' most successful album yet. It goes to number 49 in the US charts.
Sheena is a Punk Rocker was their first hit, if you can call Going to Number 81 a hit.
Sheena is a Punk Rocker was also the first song to mention punk rock in a title too. And this ensured that the movement had its name.
Tommy Ramone had enough of touring. He was exhausted, and the Ramones toured hard. So he took the producer's chair, which I think he's very, very well suited to. He's kind of the most musical in many ways. He was replaced by Marky Ramone, Mark Bell, and Marky Ramone is a bit of a mainstay on the New York punk rock scene. He'd played in Richard Hell and the Voidoids, who's another very key, pioneering, seminal punk band. So he was a good fit.
The fourth album, Road to Ruin, was quite an interesting change in direction for the Ramones. For a start, it had songs on it that were longer than 3 minutes, something they'd never done before. There were acoustic tracks, there were ballads, and fans and critics saw this as an attempt by the band to try and be more radio friendly, to try and boost sales and get more of a commercial appeal. Unfortunately, it didn't really work, and what it also did was alienate their original fan base, who were kind of unimpressed with them potentially trying to sell out.
Rock and Roll High School is one of the most interesting moments of the Ramones' career. It was Roger Corman, who's the king of cheap exploitation movies. The Ramones come to this high school where they're all obsessed with rock and roll, and the principal is trying to destroy it and ban it. And Riff Randell, who's their #1 fan, invites them, and then they blow up the school.
Phil Spector had tried to produce the Ramones before Rocket to Russia. After Rock and Roll High School, then he was invited in to produce what would become End of the Century. The Ramones' spontaneous approach and his extremely meticulous approach to building an album was always destined to end in some sort of tears. And the Ramones found it very, very difficult. But it seemed to be someone who understood the Ramones almost more than they understood themselves.
End of the Century was the Ramones' biggest hit. I think it went to number 14 in the UK charts. It's also the album that they hated. Dee Dee Ramone claims that Phil Spector used to hold them at gunpoint. You know, they try and escape after take number 241, which is completely, you've got to remember, this is a band that recorded their first album for $6,000. You know, probably recorded it in half an hour. So this approach was anathema to how they did things. And also, it had a version of Baby I Love You, which none of them played on. Joey sang. It just had these very syrupy strings.
The experience was very, very difficult for the Ramones, and of course, they'd never work with Phil Spector again. But for that moment, they really touched greatness, even if the band members often were quite derogatory about their record.
The 1981 album Pleasant Dreams showed the Ramones trying to keep up with current trends, I think. By the early 80s, punk had been kind of replaced by more heavy rock, heavy metal in the charts. So this was the way the band kind of went with this album.
Pleasant Dreams wasn't the Ramones' favourite album. It's definitely not their best album. It was a record company decision to head them towards heavy metal. And they brought Graham Goldman in to produce it, who's a quite big-time English producer. And Johnny Ramone wasn't happy with it at all. He felt that it wasn't the Ramones, too slick, too much someone else's idea. But it did have The KKK Took My Baby Away, which is one of Joey's finest moments. The KKK is actually talking about Johnny Ramone, because Johnny had stolen his girlfriend, or that's how he saw it. And the reason it's the KKK is because Johnny was a Republican, quite a right-wing guy, and Joey was much more liberal. So as far as he's concerned, this is he's sticking it to him.
The KKK took my baby away, they took her away, away from me. The KKK took my baby away, they took her away, away from me.
And they would never, ever reconcile. They stopped speaking. This was difficult. Joey and Marky were drinking very heavily at this time. Dee Dee was getting quite into drugs, and the whole thing was falling apart.
The 1983 album Subterranean Jungle saw the Ramones return to their kind of more original raw punk style, and the music critics really applauded this. Their fans applauded this too. I think the band were a lot happier doing what they did best.
Marky was fired from the band for alcoholism, and Richie Ramone was very successful. Joey says he saved the band, I think because he was hardworking and musical, and probably loved the Ramones as well. I think that was key.
He could master the complicated, hardcore drums that the Ramones required. He was a songwriter too, and he wrote Somebody Put Something in My Drink, and he gave them quite a lift.
Sha-la-la-la, 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 sha-la-la-la.
1984's Too Tough to Die was a fantastic record. It had Tommy back as producer, and he understood the Ramones like nobody else, really. It had Howling at the Moon, Sha-la-la-la-la, Daytime Dilemmas, Endless Vacation, and it was the Ramones restating what they were good at. It wasn't a facsimile of those early albums. It was the early albums, but better.
It's a really good album. It's much tougher than a lot of the Ramones albums. It's very punk, but it's also of its time. You know, we're talking about the 80s now.
In 1985, Ronald Reagan, the president at the time, visited the Bitburg Cemetery, which was where a lot of the German SS were buried, and he made some comments about everybody suffering in the war. And of course, this didn't go down well at all, particularly with the Ramones, because Joey was Jewish. And the response was to write the song Bonzo Goes to Bitburg. This was the Ramones being overtly political, and it came out very, very soon after Reagan had visited the cemetery. It showed that they were a thinking group.
And it came from Animal Boy, which was not as good as Too Tough to Die, but it's still pretty good and pretty raw.
A politician, don't become one of his children.
Animal Boy had Something to Believe In, which was one of the great Ramones songs of the era, and it had Bonzo Goes to Bitburg too. And yet again, it was another change in direction. There were a lot of synths on it, and the band subsequently almost disowned it, but they were being a bit harsh on it. Some synthesizers suited the Ramones better than anyone could have imagined.
Richie Ramone left the band after 5 years. Partly, it's said, due to the fact that he wasn't getting any money from T-shirt sales, which I guess were probably, you know, the biggest income that the band were getting.
The replacement was Elvis Ramone, who was better known as Clem Burke, Blondie's drummer. And Blondie and the Ramones had gone way back to CBGB's days, so he wasn't someone that they didn't know.
However, Clem was fired after just 2 shows as he couldn't keep up with the Ramones' fast pace of playing, and a now sober Marky Ramone returned on drums.
The big change was that Dee Dee left. He was battling drug addiction. He was battling Johnny Ramone. He'd had enough. He was replaced by a guy called CJ, who was younger and, again, enthusiastic and energetic.
In 1992, the album Mondo Bizarro came out, and I think what's interesting about this album is although Dee Dee had actually quit the band, he wrote quite a few songs for the album, and it said that he did this in payment for being bailed out of jail after he'd been struggling with drug addiction.
Mondo Bizarro had Tomorrow and She Goes Away on it, and it was their first album with a new record deal. They'd been with Sire since the 70s, and they signed to Radioactive at a period where, strangely, they were becoming very, very big in South America.
In 1993, the Ramones appeared as themselves in The Simpsons, a show that they were all huge fans of.
1, 2, 3, 4.
They appeared in an episode called Rosebud, which was inspired by Citizen Kane. They actually play at a birthday party for Mr. Burns.
Tell you, happy birthday, Burnsy. Happy birthday, tell you. When I'm lying in my bed at night, I don't wanna grow. Nothing ever seems to turn out right, and I don't wanna grow.
The band's final album, Adios Amigos, was released in 1995.
Adios Amigos included Tom Waits' I Don't Want to Grow Up. It included the brilliant She Talks to Rainbows. And the Ramones very, very clearly said that if this record doesn't sell in sufficient quantities, we will split up. And it was a good record, but as was the way of the Ramones throughout their whole career, it was great, but it didn't sell, and true to their word, they split up.
Joe Ramone died of lymphoma in 2001. He had been diagnosed a few years earlier in 1996. So he was the first of the Ramones to die. All of them died young.
When the Ramones were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2002, Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam introduced them.
The Ramones.
Believe it or not, we really loved each other, even when we weren't acting civil to each other. We were truly brothers.
Dee Dee, very humorously, thanked himself.
I'd like to congratulate myself and give myself a big pat on the back.
Just 2 months after the Ramones were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Dee Dee Ramone was found dead of a heroin overdose at his Hollywood home. Johnny Ramone died of prostate cancer less than a month before his 56th birthday in 2004.
In 2011, they were given a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award, and the people who turned up to accept it were Richie, Marky, and Tommy. And this was the first time that the 3 Ramones drummers had been under the same roof together.
Tommy died in 2014, and that meant he was the last Ramone to die.
1, 2, 3, 4.
There's a Ramones museum in Berlin. There's a Joey Ramone Place in the Bowery, and there's a Ramones Way in the home of Queens.
I think they were integral to the story of New York. I think the Ramones are considered by so many musicians and critics to be one of the most influential bands over the last 30 years because they invented punk rock. And also they kind of did more than that, because you know, with the Sex Pistols and the Clash, as important as they were quite didactic, and they sort of made these bold statements, whereas the Ramones were a lot more fun.
I don't want to be buried in a pet cemetery. I don't want to live my life again.
The Ramones' influence is incalculable. They're a very unusual case in that they influenced bands very, very quickly while they were still existing. This influence has continued to grow. Any of those kind of high turbo bands who've made fast rock and roll, who've looked great, who've had a snotty, sneery attitude, then they've been influenced by the Ramones, and it keeps on growing.
And then, of course, you've got the legacy of the Ramones as a symbol, as an icon. You know, no band surely has sold more T-shirts. They are so iconic.
I think the Ramones are the first to really coin what punk rock became. They were so funny and spirited and just really life-affirming.
I don't want to be buried in a pet cemetery. I don't want to live my life again. I don't want to be buried